Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to try to tackle a topic that I've always found pretty fascinating, UFOs. And to do this, we're actually going to be looking at a really dense but insightful paper that's called What is a UFO? And it was published in the Journal of Aircraft and Spacecraft Technology.
Yeah, it's not exactly light reading, is it?
Not exactly, no, but, that's where the deep dive comes in, right? So we're going to be going through this, trying to pull out the key pieces of information, giving you a nice, concise picture of what UFOs are, different perspectives on the phenomenon, and why it just keeps fascinating all of us.
Yeah, and by the end, you'll be well on your way to being a ufologist. Well, minus the tinfoil hats, that is.
Exactly. Leave the fashion advice to someone else. But all right, let's start with the basics. When we say UFO, what do we actually mean? The paper actually starts with the official 1953 U.S. Air Force definition, which is any object in the air that does not conform to any aircraft or rocket type currently known or which can't be positively identified. Yeah. But how does that stack up against how we think of UFOs?
Yeah, I think that's the problem, right? I mean, in popular culture, UFO is almost always synonymous with alien spaceship. But the scientific approach, and the paper really emphasizes this, is to stick to what we can actually observe, what we can verify, and not make those jumps,
I mean, it's interesting because the paper actually goes way back and uses historical examples to make this point. I mean, people have been seeing weird, unexplained stuff in the sky for centuries, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think about Halley's Comet. Chinese astronomers were documenting it way back in 240 BC, or that incredible spectacle over Nuremberg in 1561. There's that woodcut depicting all these spherical objects, and they're like emerging from the sun. Most likely astronomical phenomena, but without the scientific understanding, people interpreted them through the lens of their time,
And it's so fascinating how that lens has just shifted throughout history, hasn't it? From supernatural to religious, and now, of course, we land on extraterrestrial.
It's just human nature, isn't it? Trying to make sense of the unknown using the framework we have. But as our scientific knowledge has advanced, we've also realized that the vast majority of UFO sightings can be explained by perfectly normal earthly things.
Like weather balloons.
Exactly. Airplanes, strange clouds. You wouldn't believe how often people mistake a lenticular cloud for a UFO. Bright planets, meteors. I mean, even flocks of geese have been reported as UFOs.
It's true. But even with all these perfectly reasonable explanations, the paper points out that 20% of reported sightings remain unexplained.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting.
It's the juicy part, right?
But we also have to be cautious here. A lot of times, we just don't have enough information. The reports are subjective, so it's tough to draw definitive conclusions. And this is where the null hypothesis comes in.
Okay, the null hypothesis, I have to admit, I hear this term thrown around a lot, but I'm not sure I fully grasp it.
No, it's actually quite simple. Imagine you hear a strange noise in your attic, right? Your first thought probably isn't, oh, it's a ghost. You'd assume it's probably a squirrel or the wind, something simple, right?
Right.
That's the null hypothesis in action, going for the most plausible explanation first before jumping to the extraordinary.
So just because we haven't figured out those unexplained sightings yet, it doesn't automatically mean they're alien spaceships?
Exactly. It doesn't mean we dismiss them entirely, but it reminds us to consider all the possibilities and be intellectually honest in our approach.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But speaking of intellectual honesty, it is kind of frustrating how little solid scientific research there is into UFOs. The paper mentions that very little gets published in, reputable scientific journals. Why do you think that is?
Well, there are a few potential roadblocks. Imagine you're a scientist, right? You want to study UFOs, put out a paper. There's a real risk of ridicule. The giggle factor is a huge deterrent for a lot of academics.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. It's almost taboo, isn't it?
Yeah, and then there's the funding issue. Research like this is seen as fringe. It's hard to get grants when there's not much preliminary evidence, and don't forget about the potential political pressure. Governments might be hesitant to support research that could, potentially cause public panic.
Right, I mean, that makes sense. But if we want answers, we need that research, right? The paper does talk about some of the independent groups that are trying to fill that gap, like NCAP, MUFON, CUFOS. What role do they play?
Oh, they're vital. They collect data, analyze sightings, conduct investigations on the ground. They're essentially filling the void left by the lack of mainstream scientific attention. You could call them the boots on the ground of ufology.
Ufology, so that's the term, huh?
Yep, ufology, the study of UFOs and all the related phenomena.
All right, I'm adding that to my vocabulary. And speaking of ufology, the paper doesn't shy away from the more, shall we say, controversial side of things, the contactee phenomenon. This is where people claim to have, actually met extraterrestrials, right?
Exactly. And the poster child for this is, well, George Adamski.
Oh, yeah, George Adamski. All right, tell me everything. Why is he so important to this whole contactee thing?
Okay, picture this. 1952, California desert. Adamski claims he meets a Venusian man. Not just a quick hello either. He says he's taken aboard a UFO, shown Earth's radiation belts, and all this before science officially discovered them.
Wow, okay, so either a massive coincidence or something truly extraordinary. How was his story received back then?
Oh, it was a storm of controversy. Some were convinced by his sincerity, others thought he was just a clever hoaxer. But one thing's for sure, his case really kick-started this whole wave of contactee narratives.
So Adamski was like the first domino to fall. And get me, there's some common themes in these stories.
Yeah, definitely. The specifics vary, of course, but they often have these warnings about nuclear war, messages about spiritual evolution, a general plea for humanity to, get its act together.
It's like these stories reflect the anxieties of the time, right? Like
Yep.
during the Cold War, it was all about nuclear annihilation. Now it might be climate change or something else entirely.
It's fascinating how our fears and hopes shape how we interpret the unknown. But as we delve deeper into these claims, a healthy dose of skepticism is always a good idea.
Absolutely. Not dismissing everything outright, but not taking it all at face value either.
It's about finding that balance between open-mindedness and critical thinking.
That sweet spot, right?
Exactly. And always remembering extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that's something we'll be talking about in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. We're continuing our exploration of UFOs, and this academic paper is still our trusty guide. We've covered definitions, historical context, even the whole contactee phenomenon. But now I want to get to the evidence. What about those unexplained sightings that just keep fueling the mystery?
Yeah, that's the heart of the matter, isn't it? We need to look at what's actually been observed, reported. And one of the most iconic examples, which the paper touches on briefly, is the 1947 Roswell incident.
Ah, Roswell. The granddaddy of all UFO conspiracy theories. Even though the official explanation was, a crashed weather balloon, it's become this symbol of government cover-ups, hidden truths.
Roswell is the perfect example of how a lack of transparency can just breed speculation and conspiracy theories. And it raises a key question. What is extraordinary evidence when it comes to UFOs?
That's a good question. What would actually convince a skeptic? Someone who's naturally inclined to look for, those earthly explanations. What kind of evidence would make them say, okay, this might actually be something from another world?
It's tricky because, well, we're dealing with the unknown. But I'd say clear photographic or video evidence would be a good start, especially from multiple sources. Physical evidence that can be analyzed, not just stories.
Right, something tangible.
Exactly. And ideally, some kind of confirmation from a reputable scientific institution.
Okay, so we need something concrete,
Yeah.
something that can be objectively verified. But the paper also talks about the challenges of analyzing UFO evidence, even when it is available.
Oh, absolutely. Eyewitness testimony, for example. It's notoriously unreliable, especially in high-stress situations. People can misinterpret what they see. Memories are faulty.
Yeah, and there's always the possibility of hoaxes, embellishments.
Exactly.
So even when people genuinely believe they've seen something extraordinary, there's no guarantee their perception matches reality.
That's why critical thinking is so crucial. Asking the right questions,
Yeah.
evaluating the source of the information.
Right, checking your own biases.
Exactly.
But don't you think the lack of government funding for UFO research makes it even harder to separate fact from fiction? I mean, without proper resources, it's tough to, debunk hoaxes or conduct thorough investigations.
You're absolutely right. That limited scientific attention creates a kind of vacuum where speculation just thrives. It makes it incredibly difficult to determine which cases are truly unexplained.
Right, and which ones are just, misidentification, hoaxes, misinterpretations.
Exactly.
The paper does mention a handful of cases that remain unexplained. It's like each one adds another piece to the puzzle, but we're still nowhere near seeing the complete picture.
It's like trying to solve a mystery with only a few clues. You have these tantalizing hints, but not enough to draw any real conclusions.
And that's got to be frustrating for both believers and skeptics.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the skeptics want that concrete evidence. And the believers often see the lack of explanation as proof of, extraterrestrial involvement.
It's like they're both looking at the same puzzle but seeing completely different images.
Right.
That's the challenge of navigating this topic, isn't it? Finding that balance between acknowledging the genuine mystery while staying grounded in critical thinking and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about Roswell, the challenges of evidence analysis, this ongoing debate between skeptics and believers. But the paper also brings up another fascinating element, the role of technology. Remember the Aversa we mentioned earlier?
The saucer-shaped aircraft, designed in Canada, of course. Such a fantastic example of how human ingenuity can mimic what we imagine as alien technology.
It just blows my mind to think that something built in the 1950s, based on, what was it, the Kawanda effect,
Yeah, the Kawanda effect.
could be mistaken for a UFO even today. It really makes you wonder, what if what we're seeing sometimes is just, advanced technology, not necessarily extraterrestrial, but from our own planet?
That's a great point. What we perceive as alien today might just be advanced technology that we haven't grasped yet.
And that brings up another thought. If we were able to create something like the Aversa back then, imagine what a civilization with centuries or even millennia of technological advancement could achieve.
It's a fascinating thought experiment, isn't it?
Their technology might seem utterly incomprehensible to us.
Perhaps some UFO sightings are glimpses into technologies so advanced they just defy our current understanding.
I love how this deep dive is making me question everything I thought I knew about UFOs. It's like peeling back layers of an onion. The more we explore, the more complex and intriguing it becomes.
That's the beauty of exploring the unknown, isn't it? It forces us to expand our perspectives, consider possibilities we might never have imagined.
So where do we go from here? We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much to unpack.
In the final part of our deep dive, we're going to venture into even more thought-provoking territory. We'll be exploring the cultural and psychological impact of the UFO phenomenon and what it might mean for humanity's future.
All right, welcome back, everybody, for the final part of our UFO deep dive. We've been using this academic paper as our roadmap, and we've gone through a lot: definitions, the history, evidence, controversies, the whole impact of technology. But now we want to touch on something that the paper kind of hints at, the darker side of the UFO phenomena.
Yep.
I'm talking about those close encounters of the fourth kind, alien abductions.
Yeah, this is definitely where things get a bit more, well, unsettling, I guess you could say. Those early contactee stories, they often featured these friendly, wise aliens. But the abduction narratives that really started emerging in the 1970s, they paint a much different picture.
Yeah, it's like the tone shifted from like benevolent space brothers to something a lot more sinister. I mean, we're talking about people claiming to be taken against their will, subjected to medical experiments, implanted with strange devices.
It adds a whole new layer of complexity to the discussion, doesn't it? I mean, it raises questions about consent, the ethics of interacting with, potentially otherworldly beings, the potential for harm.
Yeah, it's definitely a far cry from the, the hopeful, almost utopian visions of those early contactees. But how do we reconcile these seemingly conflicting narratives?
That's the big question, isn't it? Some researchers suggest that these abduction stories, they might reflect deeper anxieties. Anxieties about powerlessness, bodily autonomy. It's like tapping into our primal fear of being controlled by forces we just don't understand.
Yeah, like that classic horror movie scenario.
Uh-huh.
You're at the mercy of something unknown, potentially hostile.
Exactly. And the fact that these narratives often involve invasive procedures, it
Ugh.
really adds to that psychological impact, that sense of vulnerability, violation.
But haven't a lot of abduction accounts been, debunked or
Yeah.
explained as psychological phenomena, like sleep paralysis?
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole spectrum of explanations, misinterpretations of ordinary events, genuine psychological experiences that feel very real, but not necessarily linked to actual, extraterrestrial encounters.
So how do we tell the difference? How do we figure out which cases are truly unexplained and which have more, well, earthly roots?
It's tough. But one approach is to use Occam's razor, the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the best. So before we jump to alien abductions, we should exhaust all those other possibilities.
Makes sense. But the paper does acknowledge that some abduction accounts, they just defy easy categorization. Cases with compelling details, multiple witnesses. It's hard to just dismiss them as hoaxes or hallucinations.
Yeah, that's the gray area, the space where our current knowledge, our tools, they just fall short. And that ambiguity, it's what keeps the fascination alive, keeps the debate going.
So even the darker aspects of the UFO phenomena, they force us to confront the limits of our understanding.
And maybe that's one of its most valuable contributions, It encourages us to question our assumptions, expand our perspectives, to be open to the possibility that the universe might hold mysteries far stranger than we can currently grasp.
It's humbling and exciting at the same time, isn't it? Realizing that there might be things out there that completely break our current scientific models,
Yeah.
challenge our very notion of reality.
It's a good reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, it's an ongoing journey, and there will always be questions we can't yet answer.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Definitions, history, evidence, controversies, the impact of technology, even the psychological and cultural dimensions of this whole UFO phenomenon. As we wrap up, what are some key takeaways you want our listeners to, walk away with?
I think the biggest one is that despite all speculation, all the sensationalism, the UFO phenomenon is ultimately about human curiosity. It's about our desire to understand our place in this vast universe.
It's about that sense of wonder we all share, right? The fascination with the unknown, the possibility that we might not be alone.
Exactly. And while we may never have definitive answers about the origins of UFOs, the very act of asking the questions, exploring those possibilities, that's what enriches our understanding of ourselves and the cosmos.
So instead of seeking closure, maybe the real goal is to embrace the mystery, to keep looking up at the sky with that sense of awe and curiosity.
And to remember that the universe is a vast, complex place full of wonders that we're only just beginning to glimpse.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of UFOs, everyone. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep looking up.